Welcome to this journey through one of the quietest and most persistent mysteries ever to illuminate the dark winters of the Ozark Highlands. In the years when light was survival, when candles represented not celebration, but the thin margin between warmth and freezing darkness. When extinguishing a flame was a deliberate choice made each night before sleep, there appeared a light that would not be dismissed. Comment where you're watching from as we trace the flame that burned through decades of winter nights. This video is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons living or dead is purely coincidental. Before we begin the story proper, consider what light meant to frontier families during winter months when darkness fell early and lasted long. A candle was not decoration or ambiance, but essential technology, carefully rationed and protected. Tallow and beeswax were valuable commodities, produced through labor-intensive processes or purchased at considerable expense. Every flame represented a choice about how to allocate limited resources, how long to extend the evening, when to surrender to darkness, and conserve what remained for the next night's needs. Lighting a candle was intentional. Extinguishing it was equally so. You did not simply let flames burn until the wax was exhausted. That was waste that frontier economy could not afford. You lit when necessary, you extinguished when possible, and you maintained careful awareness of how much remained, how many more nights a particular candle could serve before you needed to dip more tallow or trade for more beeswax. In this context, a candle that could not be extinguished was not merely strange or supernatural. It was a violation of the fundamental economic and practical relationship that people had with light itself. It represented the loss of control over something that survival demanded you control absolutely. And that loss, that inability to dismiss the light when you chose to embrace darkness, that was where this story begins. The year 1856 marked a period of established but still sparse settlement in the Ozark Highlands, where homesteads were scattered along creek valleys and ridges in patterns determined more by water access and arable land than by any desire for proximity to neighbors. Families lived within visiting distance of each other, close enough that a determined walker could reach the nearest neighbor within a few hours, but far enough that daily life unfolded in essential isolation, with community contact limited to Sunday gatherings if a church existed nearby, or to occasional visits when weather permitted and tasks allowed. One such cluster of homesteads occupied a hollow along a creek that ran roughly north to south through limestone country. Perhaps 8 families lived within a day's walk of each other, creating a loose community bound by shared church attendance, cooperative labor during harvest or barn raising, and the kind of mutual aid that frontier survival required. They knew each other's rhythms, could identify whose chimney smoke rose from which direction, understood who was likely to have surplus of what commodity when trading became necessary. Winter in this hollow followed predictable patterns. Snow came in December and often stayed through February, accumulating in drifts along the north-facing slopes, melting and refreezing in cycles that made travel difficult and sometimes impossible. Families prepared by laying in stores of preserved food, gathering massive quantities of firewood, and accepting that the months between first frost and spring thaw would be characterized by isolation, more complete than what they experienced during other seasons. Christmas came as a brief interruption in winter's monotony, a day when special effort was made to create some warmth and light and festivity despite the season's constraints. Families would prepare what special food they could manage, perhaps trade visits with nearest neighbors if weather allowed, and mark the day with whatever small rituals their resources and traditions suggested. It was modest celebration, nothing like the elaborate Christmas observances of more prosperous regions, but it served its purpose of breaking the long, dark season with at least one day of acknowledged specialness. It was on Christmas Eve of 1856 that the Harmon family, William and Elizabeth Harmon, their 3 children aged 6 to 14, found the candle on their doorstep. William discovered it when he went out at dusk to bring in a final load of firewood before settling in for the night. There it sat, centered on the porch boards directly in front of the door, a single beeswax candle approximately 8 inches tall, clearly handmade but showing skilled craftsmanship in its smooth surface and even diameter. William picked it up, expecting it to be light as candles typically were, and was surprised by its weight. The candle was dense, substantially heavier than its size suggested, as if it had been made with wax that had been compressed or mixed with something that increased its mass. He turned it over in his hands, looking for any mark or indication of who might have left it, but found nothing. Just a well-made candle, golden yellow beeswax, sitting where someone had clearly placed it with intention. He called Elizabeth to the door and showed her the discovery. They discussed possibilities. Had a neighbor left it as a Christmas gift? But there were no footprints in the light snow that had fallen that afternoon, no tracks leading to or from the porch. Had it been left earlier in the day? But William was certain he would have noticed it during his previous trips outside for firewood. The candle had appeared recently, placed deliberately, without explanation or acknowledgement. Elizabeth's first instinct was to look for whoever had left it, to call out thanks or at least establish who had been generous. But William pointed out the absence of tracks, the strangeness of leaving a gift without announcement, and they jointly decided that perhaps this was meant to be anonymous charity, someone from the community helping neighbors without seeking recognition or creating obligation. They brought the candle inside, placed it on the mantel above their fireplace, and admired it without lighting it. Beeswax candles were expensive, precious, normally reserved for special occasions or sold for needed income, rather than burned for everyday light. Whoever had left this had provided a gift of real value, and the Harmons were grateful even as they remained puzzled about the giver's identity. The candle remained unlit through Christmas Eve, while the family went about their evening routines. Simple supper, Bible reading by firelight, early bed as winter darkness and economy of lamp oil demanded. The candle sat on the mantel, visible in the firelight's glow, a promise of future illumination that they would use carefully when the occasion justified its expense. Christmas morning began with the modest celebration that the Harmons' resources allowed, a larger breakfast than usual, small gifts that the parents had crafted or saved for the children, Bible readings about the Nativity. Elizabeth decided that Christmas dinner warranted the use of the mysterious candle, that if there was ever a day to burn good beeswax, this was it. She took the candle from the mantel, placed it in a holder on the table, and lit it with a taper from the fireplace. The flame caught immediately and burned with unusual steadiness. William noticed this first. There was no initial flutter as the wick adjusted to burning, no variation in flame height as drafts from the poorly chinked cabin affected it. The flame simply burned, straight and unwavering, casting light that seemed somehow more present than firelight or lamplight, more defined and less prone to the dancing shadows that usually characterized interior illumination. The family ate their Christmas dinner with the candle burning, and the children remarked on how nice it was to have such good light, how the flame made everything visible without the smoke smell that tallow candles produced. Elizabeth found herself watching the flame more than she normally would, noting its absolute consistency, the way it burned without consuming wax at the rate she expected. After an hour of burning, the candle appeared unchanged, still the same height, showing no evidence of having melted down at all. After dinner, Elizabeth extinguished the candle with a snuffer, intending to preserve it for future special occasions. The flame went out as expected, a thin stream of smoke rising from the blackened wick. She left the candle on the table and went about clearing the meal's remnants and settling the children for afternoon quiet time. 2 hours later, when she returned to the main room after putting the younger children down for naps, she found the candle burning again. Same steady flame, same position on the table, no evidence of having been relit but clearly burning as if it had never been extinguished. Elizabeth called William, showed him the burning candle, and they stood together trying to understand what they were seeing. Both were certain the candle had been extinguished. Elizabeth had done it herself, had seen the flame die and the smoke rise. Yet here it burned, and examining it revealed no sign of anyone having relit it. The wick showed the characteristic blackening of recent extinction, but the flame was present nonetheless. William extinguished it again, this time blowing it out forcefully and watching to ensure the flame died completely. They left the candle on the table and returned to their separate tasks, both watching the candle periodically to see if it would relight itself. For an hour it remained dark. Then, when they were both occupied in different parts of the cabin, they looked back to find it burning once more. This pattern continued through the remainder of Christmas Day. Each time they extinguished the candle, it would eventually relight itself, sometimes within minutes, sometimes after an hour or more, but always returning to its steady, unwavering burn. They tried different methods of extinguishing: snuffing, blowing, depriving it of air under a glass, even pinching the wick with wetted fingers. None of the methods prevented the eventual relighting. By evening, the Harmon family faced a situation that defied their understanding of how candles worked. They discussed possibilities in the careful way that frontier people approached inexplicable phenomena. Perhaps the wick had some property that allowed it to retain heat and reignite spontaneously. Perhaps the wax contained some material that made it combustible in ways they did not understand. Perhaps there was a draft pattern in the cabin that somehow carried embers from the fireplace to the candle in ways that seemed impossible, but were nonetheless occurring. None of these explanations satisfied completely, but they were the kinds of explanations that allowed the family to categorize what they were experiencing as strange rather than supernatural, as anomalous rather than impossible. They decided that perhaps the candle was meant to burn continuously, that attempting to extinguish it was working against its intended purpose. They would let it burn through the night and see what condition it was in come morning. The candle burned through the night without anyone tending it, without the flame varying or the wax melting down noticeably. William, who woke several times as was his habit to check the fire and ensure the cabin remained adequately warm, observed the candle each time and found it unchanged. Same flame height, same wax level, burning with the mechanical consistency of something that was not quite natural, but not quite obviously supernatural either. Morning revealed that the candle had burned for more than 12 hours continuously, without consuming measurable amounts of wax. It should have been several inches shorter, should have melted down noticeably, but it remained essentially the same height it had been when first lit. The flame continued its steady burn, and the family began their day with the unsettling realization that they possessed an object that violated the basic principles of combustion and consumption that governed every other source of light they had ever used. Elizabeth attempted once more to extinguish the candle, thinking that perhaps daylight would succeed where evening attempts had failed. She snuffed it carefully, watched it go dark, and turned her attention to breakfast preparation. Within 10 minutes, without anyone approaching it or any apparent cause, the flame returned. The candle would not remain dark. It insisted on burning, and that insistence was not aggressive or alarming, but simply absolute, a fact that had to be accommodated rather than resisted. The Harmons kept the candle lit through the day following Christmas, watching it burn without diminishing, observing its flame without understanding what sustained it. They discussed whether to tell neighbors about it, whether to bring it to church and ask the minister for interpretation or guidance, whether to attempt to return it to whoever had left it, by placing it back on the porch where it had appeared. In the end, they decided to keep it private for the time being, to observe it longer before involving others in what might be their own misunderstanding or misperception. Perhaps the candle would eventually burn down normally. Perhaps the apparent impossibility would resolve itself into some mundane explanation they had not yet considered. They would wait and watch. The candle burned through the remainder of Christmas week. The Harmons developed a routine around it. They stopped attempting to extinguish it, accepting that the flame would persist regardless of their intervention. They moved it to the mantelpiece where it could burn safely without requiring constant attention, and they became accustomed to its presence in much the way one becomes accustomed to the ticking of a clock or the sound of wind in the eaves. What struck William most forcefully during this week was the quality of the light. It was not warm or comforting in the way that firelight was. It did not flicker or dance, did not create the moving shadows that made evening interiors feel alive and dynamic. Instead, it burned with a kind of clinical steadiness, illuminating without decoration, revealing without softening. The light showed everything clearly: the worn floorboards, the patched clothing hung on pegs, the children's faces as they sat reading or working at small tasks. It was honest light, unsentimental, and its presence made the cabin feel more exposed than evenings normally felt when firelight provided the only illumination. On New Year's Day, the Harmon family attended church services at a small chapel that served their Hollows scattered community. They left the candle burning in their cabin. Attempting to extinguish it seemed pointless by this point, and returned several hours later to find it exactly as they had left it. Same flame height, same wax level, burning in the empty cabin as if maintaining a vigil that required no human witness. That evening, Elizabeth mentioned the candle to a neighbor woman who had visited to trade some preserved fruit for yarn. She described it carefully, presenting it as a curiosity rather than as something alarming, asking if the neighbor knew of any candles that burned without consuming wax or flames that could not be extinguished. The neighbor listened with interest, but had no explanation to offer, had never heard of such a thing, and suggested that perhaps the wax was of such high quality that it burned exceptionally slowly rather than not burning at all. The conversation ended there, and the neighbor left without having seen the candle herself. But word spread in the quiet way that information moved through frontier communities, casual mention during visits, questions asked at church, stories shared when families gathered for any purpose. Within a week, most of their neighbors had heard that the Harmons had a candle that apparently would not go out, and while no one seemed particularly alarmed by this, there was general curiosity and some desire to see the phenomenon for themselves. Several neighbors found excuses to visit the Harmon homestead over the following weeks, and most were shown the candle, were told the story of its appearance and its refusal to remain extinguished. Reactions varied. Some were impressed by the quality of the beeswax and suggested it must be exceptionally pure to burn so efficiently. Others were puzzled by the relighting and suggested various technical explanations involving wick properties or wax composition. A few were quietly unsettled in ways they did not articulate clearly, but that showed in their reluctance to stand too close to the flame or their eagerness to conclude the visit. The candle burned through January and into February, a constant presence in the Harmon home that the family learned to ignore in the way one learns to ignore any persistent feature of one's environment. It was simply there, always lit, requiring no maintenance and consuming no noticeable fuel. The children eventually stopped remarking on it. Elizabeth stopped checking it multiple times per day. William still watched it sometimes in the evenings, still felt the quiet unease of living with something that violated natural law, but he too adapted to its presence. On February 10th, the family woke to find the candle gone. Not extinguished, not burned down to nothing, but simply absent from the mantelpiece where it had stood burning for 6 weeks. They searched the cabin thoroughly, looked outside in case it had somehow been removed, questioned the children about whether any of them had moved it. The candle had disappeared as mysteriously as it had appeared, leaving no trace of ash or melted wax, no evidence that it had ever existed beyond the family's memory of its steady flame. The disappearance was almost more unsettling than the candle's presence had been. At least when it was burning, they knew where it was, could observe it and accommodate its strangeness. Its absence created new questions. Where had it gone? Why had it left? Would it return? The Harmons discussed these questions without reaching any conclusions, and eventually they accepted that the candle's time in their home had simply ended for reasons they would never understand. 3 days later, on a Sunday following church services, they learned that the Mitchells, a family living perhaps 2 miles downstream along the creek, had found a burning candle on their table one morning, a candle they had not lit and could not extinguish. The description matched the candle that had been in the Harmon home. Same golden beeswax, same unusual weight, same steady flame that would not be dismissed. The pattern became clear over the following months and years. The candle appeared in homes throughout the hollow, usually arriving without warning, always already lit when discovered, always refusing to be extinguished for more than brief periods before relighting itself. It would remain in a household for varying lengths of time, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, and then would disappear and reappear elsewhere, continuing its circuit through the community with a regularity that suggested purpose, even if that purpose remained unclear. The community developed an informal understanding about the candle. When it appeared in your home, you accepted it, allowed it to burn, and did not attempt to destroy it or permanently remove it from the hollow. When it disappeared, you did not search for it or try to reclaim it. The candle moved according to its own schedule, visiting each household in turn, and the community's role was simply to accommodate its presence during the periods it chose to manifest in their particular cabin. By 1858, the candle had become an established feature of life in the hollow, strange but familiar, troubling but not actively harmful. Families marked time partly by the candle's visitations. That was the winter the candle was with us, or the baby was born during the month after the candle left. It served as a kind of communal calendar, a marker of time's passage that all families shared, even though they experienced it sequentially, rather than simultaneously. What people began to notice during these years was when the candle appeared and where it chose to manifest. It did not visit homes randomly or in simple rotation through the community. Instead, it seemed to appear in households that were experiencing difficulty, illness, financial hardship, grief, any form of suffering that marked that family as struggling more than their neighbors at that particular time. The Porters received the candle during the winter when their eldest son was ill with what was probably typhoid fever, burning through weeks of nursing and uncertainty before the boy finally recovered. The Carters had it during the months following the death of their infant daughter, the candle's steady light burning through their grieving. The Simmons family found it appeared the week after their barn burned, during the scramble to salvage what they could and plan for rebuilding. This pattern of appearance during hardship created ambiguity about the candle's nature and purpose. Was it offering comfort through its light? Was it bearing witness to suffering? Was it marking families for some purpose that no one understood? The community discussed these possibilities cautiously, never reaching consensus about what the candle represented, but agreeing that its presence was somehow connected to need rather than to mere rotation through available households. The candle's light during these periods of hardship was described consistently by those who experienced it. The flame did not warm or console. It simply illuminated, made everything visible, allowed nothing to be hidden in comfortable shadow. Families facing grief or illness or loss found themselves exposed to that unwavering light, unable to retreat into darkness, even when darkness would have been preferable to the clarity the candle provided. Some found this intolerable and attempted more aggressive methods of extinguishing the candle or removing it from their homes. These attempts failed in ways that were instructive about the candle's properties and the limits of human agency in controlling it. Jacob Morrison, frustrated by the candle's presence during a particularly difficult winter, threw it into the creek, watching it sink beneath the ice-covered surface. He returned home to find it burning on his mantelpiece, completely dry, flame steady as ever. He tried again the next day, this time walking a mile downstream before throwing the candle into deeper water. Again it returned, appearing in his cabin before he did, positioned exactly where it had been before he removed it. Sarah Patterson attempted to break the candle in half, using an axe to cleave it down the middle. The wax separated as expected, 2 pieces falling to the floor. She left them there and went about her work. Hours later, she found the candle intact on the mantelpiece, whole and unmarked, burning as if it had never been damaged. The pieces she had created were nowhere to be found. The minister of their church, disturbed by reports of the candle and concerned about possible diabolic or at least inexplicable forces operating in his congregation, took possession of the candle, with the family's permission, and locked it in a wooden box that he placed in the church's small storage room. He sealed the box, placed it on a high shelf, and prayed over it for protection and containment. The following Sunday, he arrived at church to prepare for services and found the candle burning on the pulpit, the box still sealed and untouched on its shelf. These failed attempts to control or destroy the candle established important facts about its nature. It could not be permanently extinguished, could not be damaged, could not be confined, and would not remain where it was not meant to be. The candle had its own integrity, its own purposes, and while it could be temporarily moved or affected, it would always return to its intended position and resume its steady burn. The community gradually stopped attempting to resist the candle and developed instead a kind of resigned acceptance that incorporated it into their understanding of how their world worked. The candle was like weather or seasons, not controllable, not fully explicable, but predictable enough to accommodate and endure. When it appeared in your home, you lived with it until it left. You did not try to hasten its departure or extend its stay. You simply accepted its presence as a fact of life in the hollow. The Civil War years brought profound disruption to the Ozarks as they did to the entire nation. Men from the hollow enlisted or were conscripted, some fighting for the Union and others sympathizing with the Confederacy, though formal Confederate military presence in northern Arkansas was limited and contested. Families found themselves divided by political allegiances that had not seemed important before the war, but that became matters of life and death as the conflict progressed. The hollow's population decreased as men left for military service, and as some families, fearful of bushwhacking and irregular violence that characterized the war in border regions, abandoned their homesteads and sought safety in more established towns or in regions farther from the conflict. By 1863, perhaps half the families that had lived in the hollow in 1856 remained, and those who stayed did so in increased isolation and hardship, maintaining their farms and homes as best they could with reduced labor and constant uncertainty about what news the next traveler might bring. Through all of this disruption, the candle continued its visitations. It appeared in cabins where women and children waited for news of fathers and husbands who were away at war. It burned in homes where families rationed food and fuel with increasing desperation as the war economy disrupted normal trade and production. It was present during the terrible waiting periods when illness struck, and no help could be summoned because all able-bodied men were gone, and travel was dangerous even for those who remained. What was most haunting about the candle during these years was its presence in empty homes. Travelers passing through the hollow at night reported seeing lights in cabins that were known to be abandoned, families having left months or years earlier. Investigation would reveal the candle burning alone in empty rooms, its flame illuminating furniture left behind, and walls that no longer sheltered anyone. The candle apparently required no human presence to maintain its vigil, no witness to its light. It burned whether anyone was there to see it or not. This discovery, that the candle manifested even in the absence of people, changed how the community understood its purpose. If it required no witness, then it was not offering comfort or marking suffering for human awareness. It was doing something else, something that did not depend on human observation or participation. It was bearing witness, perhaps, but not for human benefit. It was recording or acknowledging or simply being present with suffering, whether that suffering was observed by others or not. The war ended. The men who survived returned, and the hollow slowly began to recover some of its pre-war population and patterns. But the community that reformed after 1865 was different from what had existed before. Smaller, marked by loss, less certain about shared values or community cohesion. The candle continued to appear and circulate, now visiting households rebuilding from wartime disruption, now present during the grief of learning which neighbors' sons had died and would not return. In 1867, a family named the Hendersons, newcomers to the hollow, having purchased a homestead abandoned during the war, discovered the candle burning in their cabin one morning. They had not been told about the candle, were not part of the community's accumulated understanding of its nature and patterns. When they could not extinguish it, they became frightened and brought it to the minister seeking explanation or intervention. The minister, who had served the community since before the war and who remembered the earlier failed attempt to confine the candle in the church, explained its history as he understood it. The candle appeared in homes facing hardship, he said. It could not be extinguished or destroyed. It would leave when its time was complete. The family should accept its presence, allow it to burn, and not fight against what could not be changed. The Hendersons asked what it meant, what the candle's presence signified about their household or their future. The minister admitted he did not know. Some believed it offered witness to suffering, he said. Others thought it marked families for special attention from divine or other forces. Still others believed it was simply a phenomenon without meaning, something that occurred for reasons beyond human understanding. What he could tell them with certainty was that the candle had been present in the hollow for more than a decade, had never harmed anyone directly, and would leave eventually whether they wanted it to or not. This conversation, and similar conversations with subsequent newcomers who encountered the candle without previous knowledge of its history revealed the community's difficulty in articulating what the candle actually was or represented. Even those who had lived with it for years could not agree on its nature. Was it supernatural? Probably, given its properties. Was it divine? Possibly, though its presence during suffering seemed as much burden as blessing. Was it dangerous? Not directly, though its insistence on witnessing hardship was sometimes more than families wanted to bear. The closest the community came to consensus was in describing the candle not as a thing with purpose, but as a presence that could not be refused. It came when suffering was present. It illuminated what people might have preferred to keep in shadow. It witnessed without offering obvious comfort or intervention, and it could not be dismissed or controlled by those who experienced its visitation. Over the decades following the war, the pattern of the candle's appearances began to suggest something that several longtime residents noticed, but that was not widely discussed. The candle seemed to appear less frequently in homes where joy or celebration or simple stability prevailed. It visited families during their difficult seasons and avoided them during their prosperous or happy times. This selectivity raised uncomfortable questions about fairness and about what kind of force or entity would choose to manifest primarily during suffering while absenting itself during easier periods. Martha Dixon, an elderly woman who had been in the hollow since before the candle first appeared, finally articulated what others had been thinking but not saying. The candle, she suggested, was not offering comfort or marking families for blessing. It was present during suffering because that was what it witnessed. Not joy, not peace, not celebration, but pain and hardship and loss. Whatever had created or sustained the candle was interested in suffering specifically, wanted to observe it or record it or simply be present for it in ways that made the candle's visits feel less like grace and more like an obligation the community had not agreed to fulfill. This interpretation created ethical discomfort. If the candle sought suffering to witness, then its presence in a home was not neutral, but was a kind of judgment, or at least an acknowledgement, that this family was currently experiencing the kind of hardship that attracted the candle's attention. Being visited by the candle meant being marked as suffering, and while that marking came with no obvious consequences beyond the candle's presence, it still felt exposing, as if private grief was being made subject to observation by forces the family could neither see nor understand. In autumn 1873, a family named the Washburns made a decision that tested the community's relationship with the candle in a new way. When the candle appeared in their home during a period when their youngest child was gravely ill, they refused to let it burn. They kept it boxed, wrapped in cloth, sealed away in a cupboard where its light could not illuminate their vigil over the sick child. They wanted privacy in their suffering, they said, wanted to face their child's illness without the candle's witnessing presence. The candle did not force itself on them. It remained in the box, apparently unlit, though no one opened the box to verify this. The child's illness progressed without the candle's light to mark it, and after 2 weeks, the child died. The Washburns buried their daughter and continued to keep the candle boxed, refusing to acknowledge or engage with what they felt was an intrusion on their grief. What happened next was subtle enough that it might have been coincidence, might have been the normal variations of frontier life's hardships, but it was consistent enough that the community noticed and remembered. The Washburns experienced a series of losses over the following months. Their milk cow died, their well went dry and required expensive redigging. Their eldest son broke his arm in a fall that should not have been serious, but that became infected, and nearly cost him the limb. None of these events was catastrophic. None was obviously connected to their refusal to let the candle burn, but together they created a pattern of difficulty that stood out against the generally improving fortunes of other families in the hollow. After 6 months of accumulated hardship, the Washburns quietly removed the candle from its box and allowed it to burn. Now, within a week, it disappeared from their home as it always eventually did, and their string of misfortunes ceased. The family never spoke publicly about whether they believed the hardships were connected to their refusal of the candle, but their subsequent behavior suggested they had learned that refusing the candle's presence carried costs that made acceptance the preferable choice. This incident established an unspoken rule that governed the community's relationship with the candle from that point forward. When it appeared in your home, you let it burn. You did not have to like its presence, did not have to interpret it as blessing or even as neutral, but you accepted it because refusing it appeared to have consequences that were worse than enduring its witnessing light. The candle became an obligation rather than a mystery, something the community bore collectively, even though individual families experienced its visitations sequentially. The children who grew up in the hollow during the 1870s and 1880s knew the candle as a normal part of life, something that adults accommodated without explaining fully. They learned that some families had the candle and others did not, that it appeared and disappeared, according to patterns that were not quite predictable, and that you did not disturb it when it was burning in someone's home. The candle became part of the hollow's culture, a tradition that was not exactly celebrated, but that was maintained through continued acceptance across generations. By the 1890s, the hollow's population had stabilized and even grown slightly as economic conditions improved, and as the memories of the Civil War faded into history. New families moved in. Older families expanded as children married and established their own households. The candle continued its circuit, now visiting more homes than it had in earlier decades. Its appearances spread across a larger community, but maintaining the same basic pattern of manifesting during periods of hardship and avoiding times of celebration or ease. The turn of the century brought modernization even to remote Ozark hollows. Oil lamps became more common, supplementing and eventually replacing candles as primary sources of artificial light. The symbolic importance of candles diminished as their practical necessity decreased. Christmas became more commercialized, more about gifts and decorations than about the simple fact of light and darkness. The context that had made the appearance of an inextinguishable candle so significant in 1856 had shifted, and the candle's meaning shifted with it. But the candle itself did not change. It continued to appear, continued to burn with its steady, witnessing flame, continued to resist extinguishing and to move between households according to its inscrutable schedule. If anything, its constancy in the face of changing times made it more rather than less strange, a holdover from an earlier period when light was precious and when the relationship between illumination and survival was immediate and obvious. The hollow entered the 20th century, carrying this tradition forward, and the candle continued to circulate through the 1900s, 1910s, and into the 1920s. But changes were occurring that would eventually affect even the candle's persistent pattern. Young people were leaving the hollow for education or employment in towns and cities. Older residents were dying, and not all their homesteads were being claimed by new families. The population was aging and shrinking, the tight community of earlier decades fragmenting as modern transportation and communication made isolation less necessary and less tolerable. By 1925, the hollow had perhaps half the population it had maintained during the 1890s. Many homesteads stood empty, their fields reverting to forest. their cabins slowly collapsing under the weight of deferred maintenance and weather damage. The families that remained were those with deep roots in the place, those whose connection to the land or to the community kept them from joining the broader migration away from hardscrabble frontier existence toward easier lives elsewhere. The candle's appearances became less frequent, not because it was burning down or losing its properties, but because there were fewer households to visit, fewer instances of suffering that seemed to attract its attention. It would appear in a home, burn for its appointed time, then disappear for months before manifesting again, the gaps between visitations growing longer as the community it had witnessed for decades diminished around it. In December of 1929, the candle appeared in the home of Samuel and Ruth Morrison, one of the last families remaining in the hollow. Samuel was in his 70s, Ruth in her 60s, and their children had all left years before, establishing lives in Springfield and Little Rock and other places where opportunities existed that the hollow could not provide. The Morrisons lived alone, maintaining their homestead through habit and stubbornness, more than through any realistic hope of prosperity or comfort in their remaining years. The candle burned through that winter in the Morrison home, its light illuminating the aging couple as they went about their reduced routines. There was no particular hardship that season. They were old but healthy, poor but adequately provisioned, isolated but accustomed to their solitude. The candle's presence seemed almost nostalgic, a return to the patterns of their youth when the hollow had been full of families, and when the candle's visitations had been frequent and expected. In March of 1930, Ruth died in her sleep, a peaceful death that Samuel discovered when he woke to find her still and cold beside him. He sat with her body through the day, not ready to call for help or to begin the process of burial, simply staying with her as the candle burned on the mantelpiece, its light falling on the bed where they had slept for 40 years. That evening, Samuel noticed that the candle's flame was diminishing, not flickering or dancing as normal flames do, but simply growing smaller, as if the force that had sustained it for 70 years was finally withdrawing. He watched through the night as the flame shrank, becoming a tiny point of light barely visible above the wick. And then, in the hours before dawn, it went out completely. The candle had extinguished itself. For the first time since its appearance in 1856, the flame had died not through human intervention, but through its own choice, or through the completion of whatever purpose had sustained it. Samuel sat in the darkness, his wife's body beside him, and understood that the candle was gone in a way it had never been gone before. When neighbors finally came, Samuel had not called for them, but someone had noticed the absence of smoke from his chimney and had come to check. They found him still sitting beside Ruth, the dead candle on the mantelpiece. He told them what had happened, how the flame had shrunk and died, and the neighbors understood what he meant, even if they could not explain it. The candle that had burned through decades without extinguishing had chosen to go out, and its departure marked the end of something that had lasted longer than any of them had expected. The candle itself, the wax and wick that had burned impossibly for 70 years, remained on the Morrison mantelpiece for several weeks, now just a mundane object without the flame that had given it significance. Samuel kept it there, not out of reverence, but simply because moving it felt wrong, felt like disturbing something that should be left in place, even if it no longer served any purpose. When Samuel died 6 months later, the neighbors who came to settle his affairs found the candle and debated what to do with it. Some thought it should be buried with Samuel, others that it should be preserved in the church as a relic or reminder of the hollow's history. In the end, they left it in the cabin, which was locked and left to stand empty, since there were no heirs who wanted to claim the property. The cabin stood for several more years, gradually deteriorating until it collapsed in a windstorm in 1937. The candle, if it was still inside when the structure fell, was buried under the timbers and rubble. No one excavated the ruins to look for it. The hollow continued to empty, the last families leaving in the 1940s, and by 1950 the area had returned to forest, all evidence of human habitation grown over or collapsed into the earth. What the candle was, why it appeared when and where it did, what purpose it served through its decades of witnessing, these questions were never answered to anyone's satisfaction. The people who lived with it developed theories, interpretations, and accommodations, but they never achieved understanding. The candle remained mysterious even as it became familiar, impossible even as it became routine. Modern descendants of the families who lived in the hollow sometimes tell the story, presenting it as folk history or family legend, a tale about the strangeness of frontier life and the superstitions that developed in isolated communities. Few believe the candle actually had the properties that the stories describe. Candles do not burn for decades without consuming wax, do not relight themselves when extinguished, do not move between locations of their own accord. The stories are assumed to be exaggerations, misrememberings, the mythologizing of mundane events through repeated retelling across generations. But the documentary evidence exists, scattered across journals and letters and church records from the period. Multiple independent sources mention the candle, describe its properties in consistent terms, record its appearances in different households across decades. The documentation is not complete or systematic. Frontier people did not generally write detailed accounts of the strange things they encountered, but it is sufficient to establish that something unusual was occurring, that multiple witnesses over many years reported phenomena that defied normal explanation. Whether that something was actually a candle that could not be extinguished, or whether it was a series of unusual but explicable events that were interpreted through the lens of religious and folk belief, is a question that depends on what one accepts as possible. The rationalist interpretation requires attributing coincidence, misperception, and elaboration across decades and across multiple independent witnesses. The supernatural interpretation requires accepting that candles can possess properties that physics does not allow. Neither interpretation is entirely satisfying, and perhaps that is appropriate for a phenomenon that resisted understanding even by those who lived with it for years. The candle remained mysterious, not because insufficient information existed, but because the information that existed pointed toward conclusions that rational frameworks could not accommodate. What remains clearest across all the accounts is not what the candle was, but what it did. It witnessed suffering. It appeared during hardship and loss. It illuminated without comforting, revealed without explaining. It could not be refused or controlled by those who experienced its presence. And it persisted until there was no longer sufficient suffering in the hollow to justify its continuation, at which point it extinguished itself and disappeared into history or legend or whatever category we use for phenomena that occurred, but that we cannot explain. The hollow where the candle burned is accessible to those who know where to look, though there are no signs or markers to indicate what occurred there. The forest has reclaimed everything, and a visitor would find no evidence of the homesteads that once stood along the creek or the church, where families gathered on Sundays, or the cabins where the candle made its visitations. The landscape has returned to something like its pre-settlement state, and the stories that the land once generated have faded with the structures that housed them. But on winter nights, when darkness falls early and completely in that region, there are occasional reports from hunters or hikers of seeing a light in the hollow, a steady flame visible through the trees, burning in a location where no structure stands and where no camper would choose to make camp. These reports are rare and generally dismissed. People see lights in forests for many reasons, most of them explicable through reflection of moonlight or distant windows or simple misperception in darkness. Yet the reports persist, and they describe with remarkable consistency a light that does not flicker, that burns without visible fuel, that seems to be there one moment and gone the next when approached. Whether these sightings represent something genuinely anomalous or merely the power of suggestion operating on people who have heard the candle's story is unclear. But they maintain, even now, the possibility that the candle has not truly extinguished, that it continues its witnessing in the emptied hollow, burning for an audience that no longer exists, but maintaining its vigil nonetheless. We have reached the end of this journey through one of the Ozark's most persistent and quietly disturbing mysteries. A candle that burned for 70 years without consuming itself, that witnessed suffering without offering comfort, that could not be extinguished until it chose to go out, marking the end of an era when the hollow it had illuminated emptied and returned to wilderness. The candle that could not be extinguished stands as a reminder that some lights are not meant to comfort, but to witness. That illumination is not always kindness, and that the things we cannot extinguish are not always the things we should have lit. It reminds us that traditions persist not always because we value them, but sometimes because we cannot end them. That witness continues even when unwelcome, and that the hardest vigils are those we maintain not from choice, but from obligation. If you've made it this far on this journey through territory, where light revealed more than darkness concealed, and where witness became burden rather than blessing, consider subscribing to Commutales for more stories that explore the boundaries between illumination and exposure, between presence and intrusion. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on what lights you keep burning, what vigils you maintain, what witnesses you would extinguish if you could. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think differently about the candles we light and why some flames persist longer than we intend, a like helps bring these narratives to more people who appreciate mysteries that burn steadily through decades without resolution. Until our next journey into territories where light is witness, rather than warmth, and where the flames that will not die mark suffering we cannot escape, drive safely through these dark winter months, and remember that every light casts shadow. Every flame consumes something, even when we cannot see what is being burned, and that some candles are kept lit not because we want them, but because refusing them costs more than bearing their unwavering witness to what we would prefer to keep in darkness. Merry Christmas from the Ozark Highlands, where some lights still burn in empty hollows, where witness continues even when no one watches, and where the candle that would not be extinguished may still illuminate suffering in places we no longer inhabit, but that the flame has never truly left.